in telling the story of Latinos, we're not only telling the stories of Latinos, we're also telling stories about the relationships of different people in specific places through time, which it also gives spaces for dialogue between communities. So it's not only a Latino white or Latino mainstream dialogue. In a lot of our stories, there's dialogue between African Americans and Latinos, between Latinos and Asian Americans, between Latinos and Native Americans, which is the fabric of what has built this country and its diversity from the beginning of its origin as a nation. So this is not actually a new thing. And I think the project helps us to illuminate that this diversity, this heterogeneity is not something new to the United States. It's been there from the beginning as part of the experience of being an American. Well, as we know, the Park Service, in part because of the structures available and the interpretive frameworks available, have a lot of sites that belong to pre-1820, right? From then on, however, what's missing is basically what is the making of the modern Latino, if you will. All the processes, all the events and transformations that took place, so we have this population that we call Latinos. So for instance, that includes everything from landmarks that have to do with wars and revolutions, everywhere from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Central America. It involves also even sites that have to do with 20th century culture, like for instance, music. One of the greatest contributions of Latinos to the U.S. has been its huge musical culture. Yet we don't have trails of, let's say, of Latin music in America, either in Miami or in the Southwest or in New York. We also don't have landmarks that speak to the great contributions Latinos have made to civil rights or organizing and civil rights struggles. Everything from cases that involve school segregation in the Southwest and California to health-related actions taken by radical youth groups in New York in the 60s. So there is a huge gap in also our understanding, because people tend to be, if you say Latino, immediately people think of food, although they don't know much about it, but they think of food, and maybe they think of culture and music, but they don't think about the enormous contributions Latinos have made to labor, to business, to education, to making this country a more democratic country through various civil rights organizations and organizing. So those are some of the huge gaps, I think, that are presently in the Park Service roster that we hope to make changes to and enhance the understanding that people have, Latinos and everyone else, of the contributions and participation of Latinos in those processes.
Whether we're talking about the history of politics, the history of work, the history of businesses, the histories of cities, the histories of unions, virtually any subject that you can think of, Latinos have played a role, a formative role, sometimes one of the central, most critical roles in the history of the development of that aspect of the United States. That this is a population that's continually being portrayed as only recently arrived, without roots, brand new to this country. When in fact, of course, there are Latinos who arrived this year, last year, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, who are very much a part of the American fabric by virtue of their being here. But there are also Latino stories and Latino contributions, Latino involvement that extend many, many decades back into the past. And if we're going to understand Latinos today, I think, and many of us think, we have to understand how Latinos have been in this country for many, many decades. When I think about the last, say, 150 years of American history, of U.S. history, there are lots of places in which Latinos played a really important role in the development of the country. And I think, for example, about the Mexican Revolution, those transformations in Mexico and in the U.S. Southwest in the 1910s, well, they were even beginning earlier in the 1890s and early 20th century, in the 1910s, all the way into the early 1920s, marked by the political disruption and the violence in Mexico and the real concern about Mexico's future that led to the movement north of well over 1 million Mexican migrants who came to places like Texas, California, Arizona, but even into Alaska, the upper Midwest, the Northeast, the Western Pennsylvania, that reshaped workplaces, that reshaped neighborhoods, that reshaped churches. And I think that story of Mexican immigration in the early 20th century and roughly in the period of the Mexican Revolution is one of the stories of American history that's too little known in most parts of this country today. And it's really a foundational story, I think, for 20th century U.S. history, and a really critical one for Latino history. So I think this history of people as workers, as contributors to the American economy, is a key part of thinking about modern America, the most recent United States society that we all know very well. And I think thinking about American history from the standpoint of everyday people, of working people, requires us to think about Latinos. If we're not thinking about Latinos, we're not seeing America in its full complexity over the last 100, 150 years. So those are two examples of the kinds of stories, I think, that are important to understand if we're going to understand American Latino history here in the early 21st century.
History is not always very pretty. History is complex. It is sometimes very contradictory. It is often conflictive. And it matters that we know all of those dimensions of it. So what do I think, why do I think it matters? Because I think if we believe that history is only this linear process towards glory, then we don't understand really very much about life. And we know that our own lives are not easy and they're not just linear. There's bumps and there's difficulties and there's triumphs, and so it's important that we know all of those dimensions. And certainly a significant part of those dimensions have been missing when we haven't included Latino experience in relation to this larger frame of the United States. Every time that a person, no matter how old they are or how young they are, walk into a park, whether it's a national park, a state park, a county park, a city park, whatever they see, whether it's a monument or it's a plaque or it's a label or whatever it is, they're ingesting history. And so when that history is incomplete, as at this point still so much of our national public history is incomplete in terms of Latinas and Latinos, but more generally in terms of other underrepresented groups. And so I want to be part of a work and a commitment and a gathering that makes available a much wholer, a much more complete interpretation, a much more complete analysis, a much more complete presentation of what the history of this nation has been.